Woohoo! It's last video, demand side shocks. Yeah, woo! Cue the applause, except I don't have any applause to cue, so we're just gonna move. Gonna get right on it. Woohoo! Cool. So, last time we did demand side shocks. Good for us. Now we're gonna be talking about some supply side shocks. So, we're gonna cover two types of shocks in this lecture. So, there's gonna be a shock to expected inflation, right? Or rho. Remember, they have similar effects, but the underlying cause of the shock is substantially different. And then we have technology shocks, which will be a shift in the long run equilibrium level of output. So we're also going to talk a little bit about some of the dynamics governing how the systems either return to their steady states or converge to new steady states. So we're going to be looking at some impulse response functions and kind of see what that looks like. But first, what we're going to do, after a message from our sponsors, is talk about a shock to inflation. Excuse that burp. It's brought to you by Waterloo Lemon Lime Sparkling Water. This stuff's actually really great. These guys need to start giving me money. I burp a lot because of them. But this is what happens when your ADD medication wears. Yeah, and that's a real thing. After 10 awkward seconds of silence. So the shock to inflation is either going to be a shock to expected inflation or to that term rho. Right? Now, both of these guys are going to be showing up in the short-run aggregate supply equation. Now, one of these guys is this expected inflation, right? We're kind of modeling that part as is. Now, the part that is not explicitly modeled, however, is that rho term, right? That's kind of like a zero mean, serially uncorrelated like error term that is orthogonal to the other components of this equation, right? The right-hand side of this equation is going to have that expected inflation plus gamma times y minus yp part, and then that plus rho. That rho is going to be orthogonal, meaning it's uncorrelated to the other components of the right-hand side of equation 1. That is sort of the source of some supply-side shocks. Now, regardless of which one it is, right, regardless of what the origin of the shock is, it's going to shift the short-run aggregate supply curve to the left. Now, if you remember, either of these shifting short-run aggregate supply to the left means that short-run aggregate supply shifts inward. And we end up at an equilibrium point where output's lower and inflation is higher, right? Because remember, with any supply shock, output and inflation, or output and prices, depending on what type you're looking at, they're going to move in opposite directions. So if output shrinks in a supply shock, then the price level or inflation is going to go up. Now, this is only a short-run equilibrium point, and it's kind of obvious that it's a short-run equilibrium point because it's only shifting short-run aggregate supply. It's not actually affecting any of the fundamentals that are going to be driving long-run aggregate supply. So it's only shifting short-run aggregate supply. Long-run aggregate supply isn't moving, therefore this is going to be a temporary shock, or as we have heard from our illustrious Federal Reserve, it will be transitory. Now, this is only short-run equilibrium, transitory. Woohoo. So that means that the short-run aggregate supply curve eventually moves back to the long-run aggregate supply curve. So what we see here, everything in black is like the initial position, right? It's the starting point. What we see in pink is what happens after there's that left or sort of inward shift of short-run aggregate supply. We can see output is reduced and inflation goes up. Now, if this is a short-run equilibrium that we're looking at, this is not going to be affecting the position of the aggregate demand curve, and it's not affecting the position of the long-run aggregate supply curve. So if long-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand will not be moving, what is the only other thing that can move? Ding, 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 ding. That's right. 100% correct. It's the short-run aggregate supply. Short-run aggregate supply is going to shift left or in, and then it eventually shifts back out. And it keeps shifting back out until it gets right to the point where it started. If we were to look at this in a dynamic context, right? We're looking at plots of this thing over time. Again, these are things that I've taken from somebody else's lecture. I'm citing him, so it's not plagiarism, right? Sure, why not? We look at inflation, right? Inflation's going nice and steady at 2%, which is what the target annual inflation rate in the United States is. It spikes. As it spikes, right, at t equals 0, the inflation rate spikes. At that same t equals 0, output drops. Right, so let's look at what happens here. This is where we were. Inflation goes up, right? Inflation spikes up, output drops. Inflation goes up, output drops. So far, we can look at these two things right here and see that what's happening with the short-run aggregate supply shift is being described by the responses to inflation and output. Finally, we just have this thing with the real interest rate. Well, what's going on here? Well, the inflation rate's going up and output's falling. All right, there's a negative supply shock. What's happening there? Well, the real interest rate is increasing. We can see the real interest rate goes up. Inflation goes up. Meaning what happens to the nominal interest rate? Think about that on your own. But as the real interest rate goes up and it eventually falls, we see inflation falls and output steadily increases. All three of these variables return to where they were initially running before the impact hit, before the shock hit. All right, so that means the short-run aggregate supply curve just slowly shifts back to where it was in black. So the short-run shock returns to its original long-run equilibrium with no change to any real or to any nominal variables. Why is that? Well, the shock's incredibly short-lived. The spike in the input cost was temporary. The drop in the input for production was temporary. And so now I will leave it on you to think of a situation that would cause these responses. And just think about it on your own, right? This isn't going to be like a homework assignment or anything like that. Just think about what it would look like. Think about what would be causing something like this. With these three little points here, the shock's short-lived. The input cost shock was temporary. And the drop in the input for production was temporary. Think about really those last two things. Think about what would cause some kind of an increase in an input cost leading to a reduction in that input that needs to be used for production. Think about that. Just kind of think about it on your own. If you have any questions, of course, you can feel free to email me. But let's talk about something else. Let's talk about a supply, or we're of course talking about supply shocks. We're going to talk about a technology shock. It's a certain type of supply shock. This shock is one that will increase the long-run aggregate supply. This shock originates in the production function that I showed you guys, and it shifts production up, which thus shifts long-run aggregate supply to the right. Right? It's going to be shifting it out. As a result, the short-run aggregate supply shifts to the right as well, and it shifts by the exact same horizontal amount. In doing so, it leads to a drop in inflation, and it leads to a drop in the real interest rate. So why is there a drop to these variables? Well, when the two aggregate supply curves shift, it happens because it gets easier to produce. We can produce more things, and we can produce more of these things more efficiently. Think of like the invention of the jet engine, right? It leads to cheaper, faster, and easier transportation of cargo. It leads to easier transportation of people, things like that, right? If any of you are Star Trek fans, when warp drive gets invented, think about all of the awesome things that can happen when we can suddenly travel faster than the speed of light. We can go to other planets. We can colonize other planets, right? We don't have to worry about overpopulation on Earth anymore. Not only can we colonize other planets, we can also bring materials back from some of these other planets, right? So if the Earth is running low on things, and there's another planet that has plenty of them and no population to consume them, what the hell? Why not just bring them here? Well, sure, cool, right? There are all sorts of cool things that happen. And because in Star Trek, I probably just need to assign a Star Trek movie so you guys can like watch and see what's going on. The invention of the warp drive relies on a matter-antimatter reaction. And it releases a massive amount of energy, meaning that ultimately, right, we're producing energy very cheaply, very efficiently. And then on top of that, we start to unlock other things. We learn that matter and energy are interchangeable, so we can take energy, right, energy produced from the matter-antimatter reaction, and convert it into matter. And in doing so, right, we can reorganize the energy and organize it into matter that we want, like food. We can use replicators to basically just go, hey, like if you're Captain Picard, I want a cup of Earl Grey, hot, and it just, there's some Earl Grey, just like makes it for you. It's really cool stuff, right? But by having just one technological advancement, we're able to produce things a lot more easily. We're able to produce them cheaper. We can make them faster. Right? Think about all of the wonderful technological advancements that have come from the computer chip. Any of these things are going to be shifting the long run aggregate supply curve to the right. And when that happens, right, if we can make more stuff and we can do it cheaper than before, well, if our production costs are falling, then the prices, the output prices, are going to fall. Now, some of you might be like, well, no. What if, firms just want to keep pricing more? What if they just want to keep the prices where they are, but they're producing like they can produce more, they can do it cheaper, but they're still charging higher prices? Well, that's fine. But we're assuming that there's at least some kind of competition. Now, there's monopolistic competition in this economy. However, it's not just one monopoly. There are still competing firms. It's just there are fewer competing firms than what we would like to see in a perfectly competitive market. But that is neither here nor there. All that means is there is some pricing power in the market, but there's not absolute pricing power. So firms eventually are forced to lower prices. So what we see here is we have this horizontal shift in the long run aggregate supply curve, right? And the short run aggregate supply curve shifts out by the exact same horizontal amount. And I know it shifts by the horizontal amount. That's exactly the same because I literally had to program these graphs into LaTeX, and I just shifted both of them to the right by the exact same amount. So they both shift out, right? So this equilibrium point here, where aggregate demand equals short run aggregate supply equals long run aggregate supply, right? This point would just shift out all the way over here, but this isn't a demand shock, so demand doesn't move, but the long run aggregate supply and short run aggregate supply do move, right? So where these two curves intersect is at the same price level, or the same inflation right here, than what we had prior to the shock, right? But aggregate demand's downward sloping. Because of that, because short run aggregate supply is upward sloping, well, we're going to get an equilibrium point right about here, right? Output goes up, prices fall. But if you look, this is just a short run equilibrium, right? This is not a long run equilibrium point because, well, we're not intersecting with this long run aggregate supply. So what happens? Well, what happens is this short run aggregate supply keeps shifting out more and more to the right as more and more firms can update their prices. As more firms can, or maybe in this situation are forced to update their prices in order to remain competitive within the market, then the short run aggregate supply curve shifts, ultimately to a point where we reach the flexible price equilibrium, or the long run equilibrium, where literally every single firm can and has updated their prices. So what you're seeing here, right here, is just a short run response. Now, think about what the long run response would be. Well, I kind of already told you, but try to draw it out, see what it would look like. And the hint that I'll give you is exactly what I just told you, that short run aggregate supply shifts out a little bit more. So think about how and why we would want to end up at an equilibrium where this guy shifts out more. Now, it's on you to figure out as a test of your learning, although I've really given you a decent little bit of guidance so far. Now, for the dynamics of some of these shocks, what we're going to do is we're going to assume that on average, right, that rho term, that disturbance term, the residual, the source of stochastic shocks to the short run aggregate supply equation, we're assuming that that's equal to 0, right? So from the short run aggregate supply curve, if current output is not equal to the flexible price long run equilibrium output, right, then actual inflation is not equal to expected inflation. There's a deviation in expected inflation from the actual inflation that we are experiencing, right? If current output, YT, is larger than YTP, it implies, I said TP, it implies that actual inflation is larger than expected inflation. This means that agents are surprised with more inflation than what they had expected. They will thus be expected to revise their expectations upward in the future. This is something that's known as adaptive expectations. Now, if expected inflation increases, then the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts up, which makes output fall with no impact on potential output. Inflation expectations get revised, and what ends up actually occurring is the inflation rate will sort of reconverge to its original long-run equilibrium rate of inflation. Now, where does monetary policy come into all this stuff? Well, the point of monetary policy is to try to stabilize the business cycle, right? Because we're going to have upswings and we're going to have downswings. We want to prevent the upswings from being too high because we don't want the economy to overheat. And we don't want the downswings to be too low because, well, that means a lot of people are out of work and just, well, pardon my French, shit hits the fan. It's really not a good situation. So we kind of want to keep things sort of in the middle. Now, the Federal Reserve has what's known as a dual mandate. You might have heard of this guy before, probably heard it in my lectures already, but I'll explain it a little bit more. We can explain it in the context of this model. The dual mandate is to have stable inflation and maximum employment. Now, we don't really have labor markets in our model. Instead, what we have is just output. So in our model, we're going to think of it as stable inflation, trying to keep inflation close to a constant. And for maximum employment, well, we don't really have employment, but when you think about it, right, you have maximum employment. What does that mean for output? Well, output is a function of capital and labor, right? So if labor is really, really high because unemployment is really low, then that means output is also going to be really high. So think of it as like two sides of the same coin, so to speak. So if we're going to keep actual output as close as possible to potential output, we are minimizing what's known as the output gap. Now think of the output gap as this. It's the difference between actual output and the flexible price long run potential output. So YT minus YTP. I said TP again. Right? And we're going to set that equal to XT. So the idea is to minimize XT. So the dual mandate basically tells us we need to keep inflation close to a constant and to keep the the output gap as close as possible to zero. Now, the tool of monetary policy in this model is that parameter lambda, because it governs how strongly policy reacts to inflation. If you look at the aggregate demand curve, this is what we have. You see lambda shows up, well, in all three terms. Now, lambda influences two things. It influences the slope of the aggregate demand curve. Larger lambda means a flatter aggregate demand curve, right? And the shift of the aggregate demand curve conditional on an IS shock. Remember that AT, right, that bigger lambda and aggregate demand curve shifts up less. Horizontal shift of the aggregate demand curve is going to be unaffected by lambda. Now, after there's an increase in that AT term, a larger lambda results in a smaller increase in inflation. It says pi t there because I forgot to do a little slash in LaTeX that would turn it from a pi to like the actual pi symbol. But that's supposed to be a pi. It leads to a smaller increase in inflation, smaller increase in output. Now, since YTP doesn't change, hey, I said TP again. It actually should be a larger increase in output, not a smaller. But since potential output doesn't change, this means the output gap goes up by less. No, it doesn't mean. Ignore what I just said. Just ignore everything I just said about the larger, smaller increase in Y. So the bigger lambda really is like a win-win for Fed policymakers when it comes to the dual mandate, conditional on IS shocks. Now, the divine coincidence, what is it? Well, it's a finding that there's no trade-off between objectives of monetary policy. Responding to inflation stabilizes inflation, and it also stabilizes the output gap. So if any of you have ever wondered why we actually have a dual mandate, right, this divine coincidence kind of justifies why we have it. Because if we respond to inflation, right, if we try to cut inflation, keep it like close to constant, then we're stabilizing inflation, obviously. But if we're stabilizing inflation, then we're stabilizing the output gap because output is dependent upon inflation. It forms the basis of that call for inflation targeting, either implicitly or explicitly done by several leading central banks. Now, in the United States, we explicitly target inflation because we have a 2% long run average rate of inflation that is set as the target by the Federal Reserve in the United States. Now, that is of prior to late 2020. Really, I guess it was like early 2019, mid 2019 when we switched over to that. No, it was 2020. It was last year. Wow, time flies really fast. Last year we switched to an average, like sort of long run 2% inflation targeting regime. Prior to that, we had just a 2% annual inflation target. Right? So basically, we always wanted to have 2% inflation. Prior to 2012, they had no explicitly announced target, but it was usually somewhere around 1.7 to 2%. In 2012, there was an explicitly announced 2% inflation target. In 2020, the Federal Reserve announced a 2% average inflation target. Now, you might think it's like the same thing, but they're kind of different. It means in some periods now we can have inflation over 2%. And in others, we just have to have inflation below 2% so that it averages out to 2% over like a several year window. So if the Fed runs a 1% inflation rate one year and you run 3% inflation the next, then it averages out to 2%. And this gives the Fed a way to promise future monetary policies, like a future low value of that R bar sub T. Now, in the current model, which isn't forward-looking, it's not really obvious why this would matter. Now, if we had a forward-looking model, it would be a little bit more obvious, because a credible promise of future stimulus could lower long-term rates today. This would provide stimulus today and still help to achieve the inflation target in the future, right? So if you know someone's going to do something later, you kind of, essentially, we know what's going to happen in the future now, so we're preparing for it right now. And in doing so, right, just the fact that we can see where inflation is right now, that tells us where it's going to be later, and we can kind of prepare for that. Thus, the Fed is using what's known as forward guidance in this situation. Now, it's kind of useful just in general, but it's extremely useful when we're at, the zero lower bound, like during COVID, where the short-run nominal interest rate, the federal funds rate, is essentially zero. When that happens, then using forward guidance is extremely useful because we don't have to use as drastic of monetary policy measures as we probably would in the absence of something like that. So it's kind of cool. It's a neat little tool. So does it ever break down? Well, yeah. When? Well, it doesn't hold conditional on inflation shocks, right? Those short-run aggregate supply shocks that we were talking about. These are what's known as inefficient supply shocks. There's a trade-off here between the two aspects of the dual mandate. Now, we're going to get into this a little bit when we talk about nominal GDP targeting, but essentially, monetary policy is pretty good at dealing with demand-side shocks, but God, does it suck at dealing with supply-side shocks. It's not good at supply-side shocks at all. So, the next thing we're going to talk about is nominal GDP targeting. You can kind of learn a little bit about that. It's pretty interesting stuff. That wraps up this lecture. I'm pretty bad at ending lectures with like conclusions, and here's a list of what we did, and here are the things that we learned. Because, well, we already know what we did. We already know what we learned. Or maybe we don't know what we didn't learn, or whatever. But all I'm going to say is don't do drugs.